The defendant then methodically and calmly loaded their bodies into his work truck, not in a hasty or disorganized way. He was seen from the neighbor's doorbell camera backing his truck into the driveway, going back and forth into the house and back out to the truck 3 different times, 1 time for each of their bodies.
Losing time, I'm fading fast. I just wanna make it last. Try to let go of the past. I close my eyes, embrace the blast. Sleepless nights and headaches stack. Restlessness to hell and back. What's my purpose? What do I grab? A slippery surface, a heart attack. And sometimes you just gotta believe there's something that'll give you relief.
Why? Why did this have to happen? His motive was simple, Your Honor. He had a desire for a fresh start. The questions that have screamed out to anyone who will listen since August 13th of 2018 are why and how. Why did this have to happen? How could a seemingly normal husband and father annihilate his entire family? For what? These are the questions that only one individual in this courtroom or on this planet knows the answers to. I fully expect we will not receive the answers to these questions today, nor will we at any point in the future. I don't expect that he will ever tell the truth about what truly happened or why. Even if he did, there is no rational way that any human being could find those answers acceptable responses to such horrific questions. The best we can do is try to piece together some kind of understanding from the evidence that is available to us. And the evidence tells us this: the defendant coldly and deliberately ended 4 lives, not in a fit of rage, not by way of accident, but in a calculated and sickening manner. Shanann was 34 years old. She had married the defendant in November of 2012. Let me say that again. The man seated to my right smothered his daughters.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. In episode 18 of Christopher Watts' What Else Do We Know, we'll look at points 30 to 49 in the chronological timeline dealing with November 2018, obviously specifically focusing on the sentencing hearing on November 19th, which was a Monday. There was incredible anticipation building up towards this particular court appearance. We didn't know whether Chris Watts was going to speak, but everyone following the Chris Watts case were expecting answers. And although I think it was almost unvoiced, I think one of the biggest questions sort of overshadowing everything was the sort of mystery of the disposal of the children's bodies. People just, it had been on HLN and people had discussed it as well, was this whole question of how did the children's bodies get into the tanks? And a theory from True Crime Rocket Science was that they definitely went in through the thief hatch, but was there a certain amount of processing involved, something like that. And so I was certainly also interested to hear about that aspect. And the sentencing hearing itself ended up being quite disappointing in many ways. There was a little bit of information that came out. A lot of it we already knew anyway. There was a little bit that we didn't know. But what was confirmed was that the children were placed through this really narrow opening in the thief hatch. And Rourke would later say, the district attorney would later say, I remember thinking this can't possibly be true. And then he said, then you look and you realize there's no other way into that tank. And in this sense, Chris Watts surprised everybody. no one could actually imagine what he did. And, what he did, no, a lot of people just couldn't really imagine it. And yet he could imagine it, and he did execute it. The version the district attorney gave during the sentencing was of a premeditated crime, a sort of a coldly executed premeditated crime. He also spoke of Chris Watts being captured on the neighbor's surveillance camera going out 3 times, each time with a body, each trip back to the house in order to collect a body. That seems to be something that wasn't accurate in hindsight. We also found out the official reason that the autopsy reports were held back were because of the blood alcohol level. This is something that was admitted by the district attorney in a press conference afterwards. He didn't talk about the blood alcohol during the sentencing. In fact, the sentencing hearing, in terms of what Rourke said, so the fielding of the case after around about 3 months took 13 minutes. Even his press conference lasted almost 3 times longer than that, about 37 minutes. So very little time was spent addressing the facts of the case, and very few facts were addressed. Besides the putting of the children into the thief hatch, I think the next thing that shocked people was what he said about Bella fighting back and her injuries. Personally, I don't agree with what he said there. I don't think that Bella did fight back, and I also don't think that she suffered those injuries while she was alive. And I could be wrong, but if I'm not wrong, then Rourke's case was sort of full of errors. It had errors in terms of what he was saying about the neighbor surveillance footage. It had errors in terms of Bella. It possibly had errors in terms of the smothering of both children. And that's also in the autopsy report. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but one of the classical symptoms of asphyxia or smothering is petechial hemorrhages, and there are no petechial hemorrhages for any of the children. And what is also strange is that Shanann didn't have petechial hemorrhages either. And that is what makes the Watts case so bizarre, is it's, in a weird way, incredibly straightforward. I remember when I first watched the Sermon on the Porch, thinking there isn't really a story here. It's pretty obvious. He committed the crimes. It's pretty horrific what he did, killing his own family. But it's pretty straightforward. It's him, end of story. That was kind of how I saw it. And yet, all this time later, there's the second face to the crime, which is obvious things that we don't know. When did the crime happen? The crime being 3 murders. When did they happen? Was Shanann murdered earlier in the night, just when she arrived, or later? The district attorney couldn't answer that question. Were the children murdered on Sunday night, early Sunday night, late Sunday night, before Shanann or after Shanann? They couldn't answer that either. And obviously, quite a long time later, let's say 3 or 4 months later, even the district attorney contradicted himself, saying, well, it looks like one of the children, or the children, were alive based on the second confession, and then based on the video evidence, based on a little shadow moving under the truck. So he even contradicted his own version, saying what he had said at the sentencing. Ronnie Watts was one of the people talking at the sentencing hearing. He was, although he never actually addressed the court directly, he was virtually the only person who didn't. So I think Frankie read his statement, Frank Sr. read his statement, Sandy read hers, and Cindy read hers. Ronnie was the only person who didn't address the court directly. Someone read his statement on his behalf, his attorney, Gene Powers, and one thing that he said in his statement was, "We still don't have the answers." And that could really have been the headline for the whole sentencing trial. And that is why I've said in a previous video, I think it was episode 17, the district attorney should have stipulated that Chris Watts come clean to a satisfactory point. In other words, allocute, give them a statement saying, "I'm going to read this out in court," and that statement needed to be acceptably authentic, acceptably verifiable, acceptably true, for them to say, "Okay, we're going to give you what you want, which is the plea deal." Now, the flip side to that whole scenario is, I've heard people say, well, it's absurd to ask that from Chris Watts or something like that. Well, the converse is also true. When you're giving someone 3 life sentences, they can't possibly account for their crimes. Sometimes people get sentenced to 1,000 years in prison or something like that. I think Bernie Madoff also got hundreds of years or whatever it is. But sometimes you'll get someone like a serial killer or a whatever, and they've taken so many lives, their one life isn't really enough to pay the price for what they've done. And the same applies in the Chris Watts case. His one pathetic life isn't enough to pay for what he's done. He's destroyed at least 4 lives, 4 young lives. At least, he's literally destroyed 4 living people, right? And his one life isn't enough. His one life in jail, one life term in jail isn't really enough to pay for that. And so that's why he should be expected to pay as much as he possibly can. Meaning, allocute in court, stand up in court, say what you did, and if you're not going to do that to an acceptable standard, then you're not going to get what you want. The problem was that it suited the district attorney, it suited Weld County, it suited Anadarko, it suited Lavelle, it suited quite a few people that the case didn't go to trial, and I think Chris Watts knew that as well. So if they'd played it hardball and said, you need to allocute, otherwise you're not going to get the plea deal, it's certainly possible that he could have backed out and said, fine, I'm definitely not going to give you what you want. I'm not really getting what I want anyway. And that's kind of the difficult situation they were in. He wasn't really winning anything, except maybe the fact that he didn't have to account for what he's done, and in a way he still hasn't accounted for what he's done. The sentencing hearing is a very interesting narrative on its own. It's an interesting narrative in terms of the contextual aspects, and one of the reasons that I drew up this whole chronological timeline was to contextualize everything, to look at the news stories when they came out and how they were changing and all that kind of thing. So one of the interesting things that not everyone may be aware of is the sentencing hearing for Chris Watts happened about a year to the day prior to the sentencing of Patrick Frazee. Patrick Frazee's sentencing was on November the 18th, also a Monday, 2019, last year. So pretty much a year to the day, both of these high-profile cases were sort of wrapped up. Now, remember the Teller County District Attorney, who's actually just spoken recently about the Gannon Storch case. I remember him saying how quickly the Frazee case went to trial and was wrapped up. And I was sort of astonished at that, because if that was quick, then you must know how quick the Chris Watts case was. The Frazee case basically took place 3 days after the sentencing hearing. In other words, on November 22nd, which was Thanksgiving, that was when Kelsey Bereth disappeared. It was actually the day that she was beaten to death. And one can't help but wonder whether Patrick Frazee didn't watch all this from just up the road and think, wow, what an idiot. This guy, they had nothing on him, or they had very little on him, and he confessed and took a plea deal. And the problem, the mistake that Chris Watts made, and this is from a criminal's perspective, is that he gave away the locations of the bodies, right? And bear in mind, just after this happened, just after the sentencing hearing, the discovery was released, and a lot of the information then came out of the discovery, including the fact that he'd confessed to his father. And at this time, Patrick Frazee had already communicated to his mistress that he wanted Kelsey Bereth dead. I'm saying prior to this, in October already, Patrick Frazee had said to his mistress, something along the lines that Kelsey's abusing his daughter, which she wasn't, but he wanted an excuse to get his fiancée out of the way. And I think there was also a financial aspect to that. And I think he was watching the Watts case with one eye and thinking, wow, I can do this better. And I think I would, if I had done that, I would get away with it. And I think one of the key lessons for a criminal that is watching the Watts case would be something along the lines of, all you've got to do is take the person's phone and give the person a life after death, after the crime, and you are going to be able to fool law enforcement. Isn't that the lesson one takes from the Chris Watts case? And that is exactly what Frazee did. He gave Kelsey's phone to his mistress, and she sent fake messages, and it really did fool law enforcement for quite a while. And that is why I say there's a huge link, I believe, between the Chris Watts case and the Patrick Frazee case. But if we don't take it further than that, and we simply say, let's just look at the date. The Frazee case, the murder of Kelsey Bereth took place 3 days after the sentencing hearing. And that case finally went to trial, and Frazee was sentenced 1 year later, around about 1 year later. Chris Watts was sentenced about 3 months after committing the crime. And you kind of had an incredibly tight media control of both cases, in both the Patrick Frazee and Chris Watts case. Both cases involved plea deals, and I think that explains to a large degree why both cases did need to be carefully managed. And I think there was a lot of management of the cases. But what's very, very clear is the Chris Watts case was fast-tracked in super, super, super quick time. And bear in mind, this is where 3 people were murdered, and then also the termination of the pregnancy, whereas the Patrick Frazee case was 1 person. So the fact that this case was wrapped up as quickly as it was kind of totally unprecedented. So that aspect has definitely been interesting for me. The intertextual elements between Chris Watts and Patrick Frazee. I do want to recommend you guys, if you're interested in the Chris Watts case, you'll get a lot more insight into it from following the Patrick Frazee case, and you can read about it in Murder Most Foul, my book on Amazon Kindle. You can also follow my coverage at the time on this channel. If you just go back in time, you can look at the coverage that I did of all of the trial days. That is going to give you a little bit of an idea of how the Chris Watts case would have gone if it went to trial, just because there are so many elements that are similar. There's a mistress, there's a child, there's debt, there is cell phone narrative, there is CCTV footage, there is a neighbor's surveillance camera, there is the disposal of evidence at a remote location, there are cadaver dogs. The main difference between Frazee and Watts is Frazee didn't confess to the police, but he did tell his mistress what he did. He also told quite a few members of the community what he intended doing. And then there was also the shocking, I think even more shocking, disposal of his fiance's remains on his own property, basically on a driveway just up the road from his own home where his mother was staying. And while he was burning the tote, his mother apparently stepped out on the porch and saw this huge bonfire. And his mistress was standing next to him while he was burning his wife's body. It's unreal. It's absolutely horrific. There are three versions of the sentencing that you can refer to besides the intertextual one. And it's basically from What Else Do We Know, the blog post. It's around about just 2/3 down if you scroll down that page. It's a little bit dry. There are a lot of links that you can follow if you're interested. There are quite a few stories that you can go and look at as well. That is one source. Another one is, and of course, one of the things you can look at is the post-sentencing press conference. You can look at a couple of things there. There's also a post-sentencing press conference, a little interview that Rourke did with another interviewer. I think her name's Jennifer Kowaleski, which was quite illuminating compared to what he'd said previously. Then another source you can go to is a blog post I wrote dealing with a sentencing hearing, quite a long form blog post. I'm just going to read the first 3 paragraphs from it. November 19. Welcome to a bitterly cold day in Greeley, Colorado. Minimum temperatures today were 17 degrees Fahrenheit or -9 degrees Celsius at 6 o'clock and may climb to a crisp 46 degrees Fahrenheit or 7 degrees Celsius by the time the press conference is scheduled at 1300 hours. The day will start mostly sunny in the early morning and remain bright and sunny throughout. A typical early winter's day in Colorado with a slight breeze blowing over the snow-covered prairie. This is a big change from the weekend. And from there, I basically went into the news stream, how the news stream was covering the Chris Watts case, and other things that were making the news stream, including gas explosions in Aurora and a fire also because of a ruptured gas line in Littleton, and all this sort of thing. And what I was trying to do is contextualize what was going on in the political, social, cultural, economic Colorado and what was going on with the Watts case. And I was just also curious about, wow, you've surprised everyone with a plea deal, and then now we are getting the sentencing on that original court date, and just after that it would sort of be Thanksgiving and Black Friday. And the whole idea being that, when the discovery was released, people would be preoccupied with other things. And wasn't that intentional as well? So I'll provide a link to the live sentencing in the description. I also covered the sentencing and the aftermath, the press conference, in detail in my book, Two-Faced Rape of Cassandra. And I raised a couple of legitimate questions in that narrative, one of them being the weird way that it appears from, well, it certainly appeared from the autopsy when the results came out, but also from what Rourke said during sentencing, that it seemed like all three people had been killed in a different way. So you had Bella with quite severe injuries where it looked like she'd fought back, but she certainly had very clear injuries. Then you had Shanann, who had no defensive wounds, but there was a little bit of finger bruising to her neck. And here Rourke actually misspoke. He sort of first said something like finger, and then he corrected himself and then sort of said, well, it could be fingernail or finger bruising to Shanann's throat. But no petechial hemorrhages there. And then Cece, who had no injuries whatsoever. So there's kind of the implication that all three of these people died in three different ways. I was also very disappointed that Shanann's, or the finances, weren't really spoken about in detail or indeed really referenced at all. If anything, Rourke dismissed that aspect, just saying that everyone has problems with money. Well, that's true, but the Watts family had severe debt problems. I mean, they were pretty much crippled by credit card debt. One of the aspects that I criticized the district attorney on in one of the chapters dealing with the sentencing, or certainly the press conference afterwards, was where the district attorney said he didn't notice a shred of remorse from Chris Watts. I mean, he said, I didn't see a shred of remorse today.
You can't understand it. I didn't see a shred of remorse today. I didn't when he pled guilty on November 6th. I never did during the course of any of this investigation, any of the interviews with him. I think that he shed a tear for himself. I think you thought he was going to get away with it.
Was justice served here today?
I think justice was served in the best way we can in Colorado right now.
You mentioned in court that Shanann didn't have any defensive wounds. What does that mean?
What was odd or striking to me was, I think if somebody came up and put their hands around somebody's neck, the first thing a victim's going to do is grab onto the hands or the arms and try to pull them away, or scrape or claw or bite or whatever, to try and get that person's hands off of their throat. There wasn't anything like that in Shanann, and so that obviously caused us to think, was she sleeping?
But Shanann couldn't have been sleeping. If she'd been sleeping, it would have meant that she went upstairs. She would have had to have looked into the children's rooms to see her daughters. She was obviously concerned about them. She was a good mother. She wouldn't have just arrived from her trip and not looked in on her children. And if she had looked in on her children, would she have found them alive? Would she have smelled something? Would things have looked right to her? Would it have looked as if they were breathing and kind of asleep? And the other aspect is, if the children were alive, she would have expected that Watts would need to be nearby, keeping an eye on them or keeping an ear on them, and then that would create a situation where there would have to be some kind of interaction or confrontation between the two, which is exactly what Chris Watts wanted to avoid. He'd alerted Shanann to the credit card use that made Shanann suspect he was having an affair, and he was having an affair. And he didn't want to deal with that. So although Rourke is on the right track here, saying, there's something very weird going on because Shanann doesn't have defensive wounds, I don't think the answer is that she went to sleep. And so the answer's got to be something else. And this was something already established in the first book long before the sentencing hearing. I think the other part that really stood out to me, and this is point 48 in the chronological timeline that I put down, it comes from the Greeley Tribune in an article headlined "About as Big as It Gets." Something worth reading if you can. It refers to the blood alcohol content as the reason why they held back the autopsy reports. I don't think that's the only reason they held them back. I think there were other reasons as well. But at the very end of the statement, the district attorney says, the day he hit the jail, he tried to call his dad once. This is right after his arrest, so around about very early morning on August 16th. Watts tried to call his father one time, and Rourke said, but for some reason the call didn't go through. And then Rourke said he didn't make another phone call. And he said, we checked every day to listen to his jail calls. He didn't call anyone. And what I think that situation created, so this situation of Chris Watts committing a crime, going to jail, sitting there and being alone, I think created a scenario where that made Chris Watts quite easy to manipulate, in the sense of, because he's alone in jail, the people talking to him could exclusively be his public defenders. And that is ultimately, I think, the reason why there was a plea deal. Because I think if other people had spoken to him, or if he'd wanted to speak to other people, then I don't think there would have been a plea deal. So that's something I think to bear in mind. The other thing to bear in mind is, it's not true that Chris Watts didn't shed a tear or show emotion. There are reports that he sobbed during the plea deal, that every time he admitted guilt on a particular charge, he sort of broke down. And we saw his emotion in the sentencing. And, a lot of people seized on Rourke's words and said, what, he's a psychopath, he showed no remorse or whatever, or he showed no emotion. He did show emotion. And that is where I have a little bit of a problem in the way that the case is prosecuted. I don't mind Chris Watts going to jail for his entire life. I just don't see why there's a need to put kind of a false spin on kind of what was going on. And for me, the part that stood out the most from this particular day, so the words that for me were the headline for the sentencing hearing, were when Rourke said, the spotlight that he tried to shine on Shanann now shines where it's supposed to be, on Chris Watts. And I'm not sure if he said that during the sentencing or the press conference, but the words that he used there just really made me think, because for me a lot of this was about shining a spotlight. It was this idea of this spotlight that is being directed somewhere, and not so much the spotlight itself, not so much the fact that the spotlight existed. So in other words, the fact of the Chris Watts case had created a spotlight. And to me, the more interesting question wasn't so much, is the spotlight focusing on Chris Watts, or is it focusing on Shanann, or is it focusing... For me, the really interesting issue was, who is directing the spotlight, and what is it being directed away from? And I'm not sure if I agree with Rourke where he says, this was about directing the spotlight away from Shanann to Chris Watts. I agree that the spotlight needed to be on Chris Watts, but I don't really feel like, even though the spotlight was on him, that anything was revealed by shining the spotlight on him, if that makes sense. You had the situation where the spotlight is on Chris Watts and yet you still don't have any answers. There's still no attempt to get to the why. And I had a big problem with that. I mean, if you're a prosecutor, prosecute the case. Make an attempt to get answers. And instead we got 13 minutes during the sentencing. Quite a lot of that time spent saying, we don't know why, I don't think we will ever know why, and kind of a hand-wringing. Prosecutors aren't supposed to do that. And the aftermath, which was the second confession, kind of revealed that the case was sort of finalized and a bow wrapped around it. It was all too hasty, wasn't it? And so as a result of this haste, you kind of had the district attorney having to give another press conference and kind of, without admitting it, but basically contradicting what it said earlier. And subsequently, we've had the mess that has been the Chris Watts case ever since. In the next episode, I will take you through the release of the discovery documents. Obviously, I'm not going to be analyzing the discovery documents as though we've never seen them before. What I will be doing is looking at the discovery documents the way the media looked at them. And what is quite interesting with this is kind of what happened was the discovery documents were released and then it was kind of Christmas. And once Christmas came and went, the media just stopped reporting on the discovery documents. Too much time had passed. And so although they started analyzing it, they never really got far. Christmas came and went, and the Watts case was sort of flushed down the toilet. Then just a reminder that I'll be doing a live on Patreon. It'll be my first live, and it will be on Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. For those who've been following my coverage on the Vincent van Gogh case, I will be publishing on this channel just a little bit later a forensic report which will blow your socks off, which proves that Vincent van Gogh didn't shoot himself. In other words, that he was shot by somebody else. If you haven't subscribed yet to this channel, please do. Ring the bell, like, leave a comment. Please also share across your social media, and I will see you guys next time.
All of this, Your Honor, for what? Why? Why did this have to happen? His motive was simple, Your Honor. He had a desire